Okay. All right. So good evening, everybody. So thank you all for coming. It's a good crowd, and it's always exciting to see new people and old people, myself accepted, of course. Next week we will be hosting Drew Lepenzia, an award-winning essayist and an associate professor at Old Dominion University. He will tell the story of William Apess, a 19th century minister, activist, and member of the Pequot Nation who helped the Mashpee Indians gain their civil rights in 1833 through one of the first sustained acts of civil disobedience. Tonight's program is sponsored by Alex and Robert Frazee. Thank you. Some of you have asked me, how come some programs have more than one sponsor? It's a fair question, and I'd like to answer it this way. Sponsorships pay for the guest speakers, the brochures, the marketing, the receptions, everything involving the program. So if you sponsor a program, you are helping us meet our building restoration goal. It's very expensive. This is a 1763 building. We have issues all the time with maintenance, and we are also always trying to restore it and preserve it. Now we're in the middle of a accessibility project to open up the doors for even more of you to enjoy our programs. So it's expensive, and when you sponsor a program, it allows us to use the program income towards our building expenses. So thank you very much for everybody that has sponsored. But keep it coming, because we want to replace the cushions on your chairs. Wouldn't that be a good idea? We want to upgrade the air conditioning, and we want to improve our delivery as far as this, the sound system. So there are things on our list to do. Now I'd like to introduce our next guest. I'm so pleased that we have been able to host a number of young rising stars this year, and Kate Storey is one of them. Her book, White House by the Sea, has been heralded as the must-read book of the summer by Town and Country, and the most anticipated book of the summer by Elle. I'm so pleased to have her. She's the senior features editor at Rolling Stone magazine and was previously a staff writer at Esquire magazine, where she covered culture and politics. The two does not really cancel each other out. She has written long-form profiles and narrative features for Vanity Fair, Marie Claire, and other well-known publications. So it is my pleasure to introduce Kate Storey.
Thank you so much. I have been looking forward to coming here and holding a real book in my hands for more than 3 years. I started this project in the fall of 2019. At the time, I was a staff writer for Esquire magazine, and I had just written an article about JFK Jr.'s George magazine, the magazine he ran in the late 1990s. A lot of you are nodding. So I'd written a piece about that, and I write a lot of pieces, but that one I really loved working on. And a literary agent had reached out and talked to me about possibly tackling 100 years of the Kennedys in Hyannisport, and asked what I thought about it. And I knew it was a story that I would definitely want to read myself, I didn't know if it was something that I could take on. I grew up in Florida, I grew up in the South. I didn't grow up here. I just it felt kind of like an overwhelming thing to take on. And she said, well, just go there and see what you think, see how it feels. So I came here in the fall of 2019, and I just met some really lovely, warm, welcoming people who were so willing to share their stories with me. And it felt like a place I wanted to spend time for a while. It felt like a story that I wanted to tell and that I could tell thanks to the people in this community. A lot of people who are in this room today, including the Frazies who are here, and just so many familiar faces that opened up over the last 3 years, who shared their stories, who made this book what it is. So it's kind of a full circle thing for me to be here today with Tales of Cape Cod to give this talk. I'm just so glad to be here. Let's see. Oh, here we go. Upside down. So here's a glimpse of my last few years. So I did my interviews for this book in the summers of 2020 and 2021, hence the face masks in every single photo. So I did, luckily enough, I was here in the summer so I could do the interviews outside, sitting 6 to 10 feet apart with masks on. The top left photo is me with my son going on the boat tour behind the Kennedy compound. On the right is me sailing with Max Kennedy on a very frigid fall day in 2020. I had reached out to him and hadn't heard back, and I got out of the blue an email from him, and he said, I'm willing to talk to you, but only if you come on my sailboat, because you won't understand the Kennedys and you won't understand me until you go sailing with us. So I did, and I will say it was a wonderful experience, but not a great place to do an interview. But it was a great day. Because the book covers 100 years, so I spoke to about 12 members of the Kennedy family and more than 120 people in total, but it covers 100 years, so I really had to dig back into the archives to tell the full story. So I spent a lot of time right over here at the Sturgis Library, which is just an absolute gem of a research gift, really. They've digitized a lot of their local newspaper archives, and I spent days and weeks and months back in the deep, dark depths of this library, as well as the Nickerson archives, which are at the Cape Cod Community College, which was an incredible resource. The resources here are really just fantastic for a research nerd like myself. It was really a great experience. So the book and my story starts back in the 1920s. As a lot of you probably know, the Kennedys started coming here in the 1920s. Rose and Joe Kennedy grew up themselves going to various beaches with their families as a way to escape the summer Boston heat. And their first stop was Cohasset. That's the first place they rented, one of the first places they rented. And Joe Kennedy was not able to join the golf club there on account of being Irish Catholic. So they kind of kept going further and further out the Cape, trying different places, renting different homes. And this is actually a photo of Craigville Beach. This is Rosemary, JFK, Eunice, Joe Jr., and Kik Kennedy out in the water one of the summers where the family rented a house that was then called the Malcolm Cottage. This is the backyard of the Malcolm Cottage. That's JFK and his older brother, Joe Jr. And the family ended up, after a couple of summers renting, they ended up buying the house and doubling it in size. Rose Kennedy is really the one who wanted to buy that specific house because it had a beautiful flat yard for the kids to play, a place for her to sit and watch them, and a place to swim in the backyard as well. So they ended up buying it, doubling it in size, and one of the big pieces of the renovation was turning the basement into a full-fledged movie theater. Joe Kennedy at the time was working in Hollywood, and he wanted to have kind of the best of the best movie facilities in his basement. So here's a glimpse of that. Another thing I really love about this picture is, to me, of course this is a book about the Kennedys, but to me more than anything else, it's a book about a place and a book about a community. And so I really wanted to get to know the people who had a big impact on the Kennedys over the years. And one of my favorite people to learn about was this woman named Nancy Tenney, who's in the right. I just gave a talk earlier today, and her daughter was in the audience, which was quite amazing. But Nancy grew up in the house, her family bought the house that the street dead ends. The Marchand Avenue dead ends. One of the houses is the Kennedy big house, and the other house was her house. So she really grew up with these kids, and saw them as they kind of became more and more important in the national conversation. So this picture brings us up to the 1950s. That's Joe Kennedy. By this point in time, the family has experienced extraordinary tragedy. They've lost their son, Joe Jr., in the war. They've lost their daughter, Kik. Their daughter, Rosemary, has been sent away after her botched lobotomy. And so in the 1950s, Joe Kennedy said he wanted to give back to the community in some way. He had $150,000. He called the people he knew in town and said, what can I do with it? What would be something we could do for kids specifically in the community? And they built this ice skating rink, which I don't know if any of you remember this ice skating rink in town, named after Joe Jr. I've been asked a lot, and as I talk about this book, who do I have a favorite family member? Who did I most like learning about? And I surprised myself by being very interested in Rose Kennedy, the matriarch of the family. I found her incredibly interesting. I think when you see her, you read about her, she always comes across as very stoic, very serious. Her family has had an incredible amount of loss, and she was always kind of the brave face of the family. But what I found really interesting when thinking about her through the lens of Hyannisport, which is really a place that she considered her home, it was a place where she could let her guard down, where she could kind of grieve, she could be with her family. I just really felt like I saw a different side of her in researching this book, so I'm going to read just a couple of paragraphs that show that side of her a bit. Rose was also after when the family first moved in. What I was told by neighbors and what I saw in my research was that the kids really kind of made fast friends with the neighbors. Rose and Joe kind of kept to themselves, particularly Rose at the beginning. Over time, she opened up to the neighbors, but at the beginning, it was a place to be with the family. So here's a quick passage. Rose was particularly uninterested in getting to know the other women in the neighborhood. Her days were full with Mass and her children and her husband when he was there, and for herself when she had a spare moment to steal away. She didn't like being out on the water, but she had a little prefabricated hut built on the edge of the property overlooking the sea, which was just for her. She loved her large family, but Mother had sometimes overwhelmed her. There was nowhere in that big house that was completely quiet, where she could breathe, be with her own thoughts. There was always someone knocking on the door, someone who needed something from her. It's solitary confinement, not splendor, I need, she once said. Any mother will know what I mean. She went out to her little hut to sit and think, or read, or pray. So I like that as a mom of a 6-year-old boy. I found that desire. I think people think about the Kennedys as they have everything in the world, and I think I was able to kind of relate to her in a way as a mom, of a mom who just needed a place for some quiet every once in a while. Was a great moment, I thought. As I said, the book it's about the Kennedys, but it's also really about the community and this place. And I love learning about other people who had a big impact on this community, and one of them was Eugenia Forts. What I found when I came here, the one public beach in town, the fact that it was named not for the Kennedys, it was named for this woman named Eugenia Forts, really kind of piqued my interest. And it was actually working with Tales of Cape Cod, who had incredible resources, incredible interviews with Eugenia Forts that I kind of got to learn more about her too. I spoke also to her nephew. And in the book, I was able to find really great stories of the impact she had on the Kennedy family as well. So the people who were kind of lesser known, but who had a big impact on this family, I found really interesting, important stories to tell as well. So this is when things kind of changed. This is the 1950s, when JFK brought his then brand new fiancée, Jackie, back to Hyannisport. They brought back a photographer who I was able to speak to the photographer's family. And a number of local photographers and reporters came to the house as well. And as far as my research shows, this was the time when really you could really see the press descending upon Marchant Avenue. You see them descending upon what is going to eventually grow into the Kennedy compound. And here's a kind of a peek inside the big house that you can kind of see Nantucket Sound behind where Jackie's sitting there. And of course, by this point, when JFK became president, so there was the big house there. A lot of you probably already know this, but there's the big house there, and JFK and Jackie had bought the house kind of catty corner to the big house, and then right behind the big house was bought by. Eventually, it was actually technically bought first by Teddy. but then it was then passed to Bobby and Ethel. So the 3 houses connected by that lawn there officially became the Kennedy compound. And some of the great stories I heard from members of Tales of Cape Cod and other people I spoke to for the book is they had this very visceral memory of this helicopter sound coming and running with their parents down into the street to see the president land and to see the kids, all the Kennedy kids kind of running and piling onto that big Tunerville trolley, as they called the golf cart. And the memories, I was told, were really incredible. This was a video that seems to not be working. That's okay. Oh, is it going to work? We'll give it a minute. It's okay if not. It's just a video of the helicopter landing. I was also told these great stories about when these little huts went up around the Kennedy compound, where the summer cops and the Secret Service were kind of stationed around the house. I was able to talk to a number of so-called summer cops, which is a kind of a term I had never heard before working on this book, and one of them I think is here, but I was told these incredible stories about what it was like to work kind of protecting this space and kind of dealing with the changing dynamics of this neighborhood, kind of represented by these little huts that showed up in the early 1960s. And this is the Yachtsman. I also heard great stories about people working at the Yachtsman. This became kind of the central location for a lot of the press that came to town. And I was told stories about Press Secretary Pierre Salinger kind of entertaining all of the press by playing the piano and singing. And I also spoke to Alan Alda, who very early in his career was in a comedy troupe, and they came to stay at the Yachtsman and performed in the basement. And Alan Alda's role was impersonating JFK. And he remembers it very, very well. And he said it was a very hard gig because he would have to kind of read the newspapers and understand what the press had asked JFK that day and try to come up with his own funny twists on whatever JFK's answers were. And they had somebody who played Khrushchev, and it was just like a whole very kind of that moment experience. He remembered it quite well. There's more photos of. That's Bobby after one of the helicopters landed for a weekend in Hyannisport. Here's a peek inside the big house. JFK held meetings with members of his cabinet at the house, so it wasn't just a place to vacation, it was a place where he did work during his presidency as well. And I actually just earlier today was speaking to somebody I spoke to for the book who saw this photo, and he said, you have to tell everybody that the door in the back was the door to JFK's bedroom. So there were 2 bedrooms on the first floor of the big house. One was JFK's room, and they still call it the president's room, and the other was his brother Joe Jr.'s room, which was later turned into a TV room after he died in the war. But this is a peek of kind of the business that happened in the big house as well. This is JFK Jr. Driving the boat. I really love this picture. My son was about this age when I was doing my research for the book, so I love these old pictures. This is Sandy Eiler. I wonder if anybody in here remembers Sandy Eiler. He was technically the athletic director for the family. He was hired to it was kind of like a part babysitter, camp counselor, athletic impresario. He had been an Olympian diver, I believe, in Canada. But the members of the family I spoke to remembered very strongly Sandy Eiler coming and waking them up and kind of dragging them out of bed and taking them swimming. I spoke to a member of Sandy's family about his work with the Kennedys as well. He was a very important figure, especially to the children of that next generation. And here's another kind of a peek inside the house. So Bradford's Hardware, I don't know if any of you remember Bradford's Hardware. It sounds like yes. Bradford's Hardware was a funny place in the book. What I found when talking to members of the family and neighbors is that the Kennedy compound could be a tricky place for in-laws. It was a very competitive, tight-knit family and a loud family. And Sergeant Shriver, the husband of Eunice Kennedy Shriver, I spoke to many of his sons, and they said that Bradford's Hardware is where Sergeant would go to get away from the family to kind of get a breath of fresh air. So there was always something that needed to be fixed. The boat always had some problem that Sergeant was able to find. There was always an issue with the dog's crate. For some reason, nobody ever understood what the issue was. but he always had a reason to go to Bradford's Hardware. And they said that everybody at Bradford's Hardware knew Sargent, and everyone in Sarge knew everybody who worked there too. So he would go to hang out and ask about people's families and their kids and things like that. And it was just kind of a retreat for him. Of course, there are the celebrities that the Kennedys brought. This is Frank Sinatra and at the time his young girlfriend Mia Farrow. And I spoke to a lot of people who remembered this incident very vividly. This was after JFK died. Sinatra and Mia Farrow came on their yacht, and it was parked behind the Kennedy compound. And they came over on a little kind of putter boat, and to kind of give their respects to Joe Kennedy. And Mia Farrow went down to the news shop and got newspapers and magazines. And then that evening, members of the Kennedy family went out to the yacht and they grilled steaks and had drinks. And talking to members of this community here, there were certain moments that would kind of come up again and again, and some were big and some were little. And this was one of those kind of little moments everyone kind of remembered. And then, of course, the 80s. Brought two really big Kennedy weddings. There was Caroline Kennedy's, and then the bigger, flashier Maria Shriver Arnold Schwarzenegger wedding, which is what this photo is from. That's, of course, Andy Warhol and his date, Grace Jones, who showed up late and made quite a scene. And Andy Warhol later wrote in his diaries, it was a scene unlike he'd ever seen at a church before. Oprah was there. Oprah spoke at the wedding. Diane Sawyer was there. It felt like kind of a turning point of when this went from a political family to really a family of celebrities themselves. As I mentioned, this whole kind of project started with an article I had written for Esquire magazine about JFK Jr. So I came into this book project kind of knowing the most about him, but really knowing a lot about him as in his career, and as a fellow member of the media, I thought a lot about him as a magazine editor and about this magazine that he created that was kind of, in some ways ahead of its time. It covered pop culture and politics, as I do, and it was kind of one of the few at the time that did that. But then coming here and talking to a lot of his friends about his life in Hyannisport, I feel like I got to know another side of him, and it felt like this was a place where he really went to kind of get away from everything. When, right out of Brown College, he was named the sexiest man alive by People magazine, and the paparazzi suddenly descended upon, really everywhere he went, but including Hyannisport. And so I kind of learned about this. This was a place for the most part that he was able to get away from it, though not always. And of course, this family has experienced an extraordinary amount of tragedy, and his death included. And so I talked to a lot of people about those couple of days after his plane went down. And the press attention that brought as well, an incredibly painful press attention. And before he died, he was spending more and more time at his parents' house in Hyannisport. His mom had moved to Martha's Vineyard, but he was really spending a lot of time here in Hyannisport, and he was working on a big renovation of the home. It was really important to him that the house be comfortable and updated to spend with his new wife, Carolyn, or not new at that time, but his wife, Carolyn. But he also wanted it to look and feel like it always had. So he had a lot of opinions about what the windows were made of, for example, and what the countertops look like. So this brings us up to today. This is one of the Kennedy sailboats. There are a lot of tradition. That's Max in the middle, who again took me on a wild sailing ride. And this is them playing football on Thanksgiving. So as I said, I spoke to a lot of members of the family about the traditions that have continued. One of them being the football game, and there are a lot of kind of little Thanksgiving traditions that are still important to the family that have continued. But they told me overall they're really not a family that spends a lot of time looking back. That they're not a family that spends a lot of time reminiscing. And really these houses, I said, why do you keep coming here? This is a place that has such incredible deep history, a lot of it painful, a lot of it positive. And the answer was so simple and so relatable, and it was, this is where our family is, and this is how our cousins know each other. And the cousins that come to Hyannisport, not all of them come, but the ones that do, those are the kids that have these incredibly close, tight-knit relationships, because this is our home. And I felt as a parent myself, it was a point that I could relate to. So that brings us up, that's 100 years, that brings us up to today. And as I've given these talks, I've I've found that people in the audience have so many memories of the Kennedys themselves, but they're usually from afar, and they still mean so much to them. So people will raise their hand and say, I remember seeing this moment on TV, or I remember when JFK died. And the Kennedys have had such a lasting impact on so many people, which has been such an incredible part about talking about my book. But I wanted to make sure I left plenty of time, particularly with this group, for questions, or if anybody wants to share their stories, I would love to hear them as well. Yeah, you're here.
So what's the current status of the big house, and how can we get there?
Good question. Good question. It's owned by the Edward M. Kennedy for U.S. Senate Institute. It was closed for COVID the entire time I was working on the book, very frustratingly. They have a new person running that institute now, and he's in the process of deciding how he wants to use the house. For the last 5-7 years, it's been used for events for the family. So I interviewed Patrick Kennedy, who owns a house on that property that used to be a garage, that he turned into a really lovely little cottage on the property. So I interviewed him there, and he kind of pointed to it and was like, well, we don't go in there either. It's used for events, and they're kind of experimenting with how to use it. Rose Kennedy, when she was alive, wanted it to be some sort of historic house museum. She was so proud of the legacy of the family, particularly of that house. But anybody who's been there knows it's a very tricky property. It's in a very residential part of the neighborhood on a very small dead-end street with no room for parking. And a lot of people still obviously live on that street except for in that specific house. So it is to be determined. Yes?
2 questions. You mentioned, I think that you've spoken to 12 members of the family?
Yes.
So could you tell us who they were? And the second question, sort of a second tag, was did you find it much of an impediment talking to people with masks on? Both
Yeah. Yes, all 12. I have them all listed in the book, but Carrie Kennedy was one of the first ones I spoke to, was incredibly helpful. She runs the RFK Human Rights Foundation now, so I kind of started with the most public-facing members of the family, and part of her job is kind of maintaining the legacy of her father and the family. So I talked to her several times. I talked to her early on, and she was wonderful, and she introduced me to some of her brothers and cousins. So Chris Kennedy was one I interviewed. He owns Bramblетide, the house that was the last house that JFK and Jackie lived in, so I interviewed him there and spoke to his wife. Tim Shriver is another one I spoke to pretty early on. He runs the Special Olympics, so again, the family's legacy is kind of part of his career, and he was also incredibly helpful and open and warm and kind. And he introduced me to some of his siblings as well, so Mark Shriver and Anthony Shriver. I didn't talk about it in this presentation, but all 3 of them shared really wonderful stories about their Aunt Rosemary Kennedy, who inspired the Special Olympics, and also Best Buddies, which Anthony Shriver runs, and she was another one who I just really loved learning about. Kathleen Kennedy Townsend I spoke to. She was a funny one. I spoke to her right after Max Kennedy. I spoke to her brother on the sailboat, as I said. That was my first time sailing, and I mentioned that to Kathleen Kennedy Townsend a couple of weeks later. I said, Max just took me sailing for the first time, and she was like, how could you possibly write a book about the Kennedys if you don't know how to sail? So I tried to learn the best that I could. Bobby Kennedy and his wife, Bobby Kennedy Jr., his wife, I spoke to very briefly. I don't know what number I'm up to now, but I spoke, yes, that's a chunk of them. And then masks. Masks were hard. It was very hard. As I said, I signed this book contract in March of 2020, and it was just days later that COVID hit, and I really thought I was not going to be able to do it. I came at this project as a journalist. I'm not a historian, I'm not a presidential scholar, I'm a journalist. The way that I gather information is by talking to people and digging. And to think that I wasn't going to be able to do that, or that I was going to have to do that in limited ways, I remember kind of talking to my husband saying, I just don't think I'm going to be able to do it. And luckily, because it was the summer and we could speak outside, and there were masks by that point, that first summer, I was able to do it, luckily. But it was more challenging kind of thinking about it than it was physically doing the interviews. The interviews ended up being fine. It was more kind of the nervousness of what a big change this was and how I normally do interviews.
I was actually got the chance to go in.
Oh, did you? That's amazing.
My friends own the architecture firm that redid the Hyannis Museum, the Kennedy JFK Museum in Hyannisport,
Mhm.
an event for donors. And luckily his wife didn't want to go, so he invited me.
Oh, that's great.
It was like sitting in a history book. It looked just like the photographs of like the cabinet meetings, you know.
Yeah.
And what struck me was that it was really a home.
Yeah.
The photographs that we all have on our pianos and on our walls and on our bookcases were the photographs in the documentaries and in these classic black and they were their photographs, their memories of their families.
Yeah. No,
You know, we all think we know them, you know, but it's amazing.
yeah, absolutely. I spent some time in Ethel Kennedy's home. She still lives there, and I interviewed Kathleen Kennedy Townsend in that home. And it was, again, it was just a home, and there were kind of peppered into all of these incredibly historic photographs. There were just like pictures of, baby pictures and kids who I didn't recognize who were the newest generation. And then next to this incredible picture of Bobby Kennedy, or Bobby Kennedy's bust was there. And it's kind of the mix of those that I find so interesting. Yes.
Did you use the National Archives or the Kennedy Library for this research?
Yes, I did. And yes, well, that was another huge challenge, again, with the pandemic, is that JFK Library was closed for 2 years. I had 2 years on my book contract, so it was closed to the public for researchers for the entire time I worked on the book. However, there were some incredibly kind and patient archivists who were going in like once or twice a week, who I had formed very close relationships with. Also, their digital archives are great, so that was a great starting point. That gave me a really great kind of foundation, but there was a lot in there that either wasn't up yet or that wasn't listed online, that they would dig for me and then send me, audio recordings or scans, and kind of going page by page and scanning. And I just had to trust that they knew what was there and they would find what was there for me. But it was just a huge challenge doing this kind of from my, at that time, apartment in Brooklyn, saying like, is there anything in this folder, page 17? How does that look? And it was tricky. The National Archives I used a bit, but not as much as JFK Library, which was just an incredible resource. And your papers as well were very helpful on Bramblетide. Yes.
Did you know that JFK's first Brambletide as president was for Chrissy's christening?
Oh, really? Oh, that's great. That's great. Then he lives there now. That's incredible. Yes, this one. Yes. Oh, that's a great question. Jackie is a really interesting one, and kind of in the 100-year span, her piece is kind of a small piece of the 100 years, but a very important piece. And so many people I spoke to, I'm thinking of Rob Stewart is here, and so many others. Inevitably, when I was at people's houses, the conversation at some point would turn and they would say, I have to run back and show you something. And they would bring out a letter from Jackie or something she had signed. She seemed to form these incredible relationships with the people here, even though she wasn't here for that long overall, and seemed to have left just an incredible impression on the people she did cross paths with here. So the stories about her were really... people felt very strongly when they shared their stories about her. Yes? Oh, I'd love to hear it.
Well, in 1972, I was a junior in college, and I was the assistant tennis pro at Hyannisport. And I was teaching tennis to Cara and Patrick Kennedy. Their father, Senator Ted Kennedy, came up and sat down and was talking. He said, would you be interested in coming over to the compound and teaching my wife, Joan?
Oh.
And I said, twist my arm. So I spent a fair amount of time over at the compound, and also wound up teaching a lot over at the Shrivers, because I was teaching Lewis and Sergeant Shriver, and also Gene Smith and Patricia Lawford.
Yeah.
So it was kind of an interesting summer, but one particular interesting experience was, because it was an election year with George McGovern and then Nixon and Agnew, I was giving a lesson one night to Sergeant Shriver and Eunice Shriver, and they invited me up into the house for a glass of iced tea afterwards, about 6 or 7 at night, and the phone rang, and we were standing in the foyer, and the phone rang in the study, which was just off to the side, and Eunice went to answer the phone, And she came back and said, "It's George."
Oh, wow.
So it was George McGovern actually asking Sergeant Shriver to be his running mate. In
Wow.
1972 election, so I scooped Walter Cronkite.
That's amazing. Oh, I love that. I wish I'd talked to you for the book. That's amazing. That's great. Thank you for sharing that. Any others? Oh, yes.
What were some of the surprises that you uncovered as you went through your research?
Yeah, I mean, lots of just little things here and there. The biggest surprise to me is probably not a wholly satisfying answer to people who live here, but the Hyannisport itself surprised me so much. When I first came here, I'd never been to Hyannisport when I came in 2019 when I first started doing my research, and I put it into my Google Maps and it said, "You've arrived," and I was kind of like, surely this isn't it. I grew up in Florida, where a lot of the you think of an exclusive community in Florida, and there are often huge, gates and fences and security guards and hedges and all of that. And the fact that these houses were fairly close together and you could kind of see the houses and they were lovely, but they were houses that you could, they were right there, is a small thing, but it really kind of informed the entire book for me. And I was told by the family, I was told by neighbors, that's what people love about Hyannisport, that they can walk barefoot across the lawn, they can go have, cocktails on each other's porches, you can walk down to that tiny little yacht club there. That's Hyannisport, that's what people love about it. And when I do talks, not here, but anywhere else, everyone's like, well, what does it look like? Is it, and I think when you think compound too, you think, huge, enormous mansions behind gates. And just that being what it is, it really was my biggest surprise that became kind of the heart of the whole piece for me. Yes?
When my family moved here in 1951, my father bought the Kennedy chauffeur's house.
Ah.
It was strictly summer. He had a lot of work to do. But there was a 3-car garage in the backyard, gas pump, and a gas tank. And you may do. Then as we grew, I worked at the little store in Hyannisport when I was 14. And I couldn't tell the Kennedys from the chauffeurs. The same.
Yeah.
So it's just one of those things.
Oh, that's great. The news shop, right?
And
Yeah. Oh, that's great. I love that.
And they didn't want my mother to get a post office box because we were on the wrong side of the hill.
Oh, really?
So we were on the wrong side of the hill.
Oh. There's one up here. Yes.
I appreciated that picture you had of Virginia Forts there. So what was her relationship with the Kennedys and how did she become prominent there?
Yeah, so she worked for some of the family members who lived on nearby. So she talked in interviews in her life about her relationship to Ted Kennedy. So she kind of saw him grow up. And I talked to her nephew, who told me a funny story about she would always tell the family that Ted would come over and try to to take little pieces of the pie or whatever. She was out cooling on the various porches, and she would have to come, tell him no. But so she knew that generation from when they were very young. And the Reverse Freedom Rise, which Tales of Cape Cod has done incredible work with. Of course, she was a big piece of trying to making sure that people who arrived off those buses had a proper place to stay and had all the accommodations that they needed. And I thought that was a really interesting piece of Kennedy history. And it was a moment where the Kennedys were known for their work with civil rights, did not quite know what to do. And it's a story I tell in the book that it made them kind of uncomfortable. They didn't know quite what to do. And there was a secret meeting with Eugenia and Ted Kennedy after the first bus full of people arrived. And he kind of turned to her for advice about kind of what to do. And she kept it very quiet, very secret, away from the local press. And so that's the most prominent moment. Yeah. Yes.
Did you pick up any scuttlebutt or stuff you didn't know previously about, say, JFK or Cuban Missile Crisis? Mistresses?
Well, The mistress piece was Gloria Swanson spent time here, which I hadn't read before. Of course, people knew that she had an affair with Joe Kennedy, and I dug way deep into the newspaper archives, and there was incredible coverage of her coming here. Of course, nobody knew they were having an affair at the time, but if you do the math and you look at her biography and her memoir and you realize the timing, you realize that was when she was having an affair with Joe. And to me, that was a really important fact, because at the time, that was not a house that was used for work. It was really a family house. Like, Joe did not bring colleagues there. Of course, there are these photos of events taking place there, and JFK bringing his cabinet members there and all of that. But at that time, it wasn't, and it was really a place for Rose Kennedy. It was kind of a sanctuary for her and that family, and the fact that he brought Gloria Swanson there was, I think, quite telling about Joe Kennedy. Yes. Yes, I did. I talked with his son, maybe, or his nephew. I talked to somebody in the Wirtanen family, and he's such an interesting figure as well. His time he spent with Joe on the boat, and then how he kind of played in to other kind of. I'm blanking on the name of the very famous writer who the fictional piece was based on him. What is his name? It will come to me as soon as I start talking about something else. But I did, I did. Is that it?
Are you planning to write another book?
So I just started at Rolling Stone in January, so I'll be doing just that for a little while. The book was really fun to write. It was also very hard. So I'm going to take a minute and kind of think about what I want to do, next. But for now, I will just be editing and writing stories for Rolling Stone for a little bit. Yes.
What was the reaction of the Kennedys on your book? What kind of feedback?
Yeah. Well, I haven't heard they have it. I don't know. I haven't heard yet. They were all excited to read it. So hopefully they're reading it now, and I'll find out at some point. But in general, they were really eager to work with me. I've talked to a lot of other Kennedy writers, and the first thing they kind of ask is like, "How did you get so many people to talk to you?" And I really did not think that many people would talk to me. I kind of went into it with very low expectations. And as a journalist, it's like, well, if one group of people won't talk, you just keep talking to other people and keep moving along. But a lot of them were really eager to talk, excited to talk, very open, invited me into their homes, showed photographs, and introduced me to neighbors, and really kind of welcomed me into that community, more so than I was expecting, and it was great. It was really a nice surprise.
Well, I'd like to invite everybody to come and talk to the Storey and buy her book. The Tickham's Bookshop has brought a whole bunch for you guys. So thank you very much for coming and joining us for our presentation.
Thank you.